So good, love the energy. Great, we're having a great time. So it is my privilege to introduce Kevin Roth, who is the PhD Vice President of Research for the National Recreation and Park Association. Back to my roots as a past president of the National Recreation and Park Association, it was great to be able to call on them to come out and specifically come to talk a very important topic of what they've got research. Kevin, he leads the collection and dissemination of data and insights for the parks and recreation field. He sets research agenda with two primary areas of focus: collection of performance benchmarks and development of key insights that make the case for increased funding support of Parks and Recreation Agency, and through the lens of NRPA's three pillars of conservation, health and wellness, and social equity. Kevin joined the National Recreation Park Association in 2015, so you came in after I was there, but we are glad you're here because he's got data and we've talked about data. So welcome, Kevin.
Good morning, and thank you for bringing me out here, and thank you for the wonderful weather. I got to say one thing. I'm sorry you're going to hear this for the third time. So I'm from Washington, D.C., or basically the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and we don't handle this very well. We've had 3 snow days so far in my county for 1.5 inches of snow. So, and that's not a joke. We're actually out of snow days over rain, basically. So what I'm going to talk about today is to talk about the strong public support for public parks. This is obvious, perhaps, to you, but in some ways we haven't had that data in the past to really sort of back it up. And I think it's really important that we kind of go over some of this information a bit and see what we've learned. We also are going to talk a little bit about a study that we commissioned on what public officials think about the work of this district and of agencies across the nation, and how that sort of affects funding. Some very interesting results we got back from that study. We're going to talk about agency spending trends. You kind of already know those, but I'm going to kind of give you sort of a more national perspective about it. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the economic impact of parks and recreation from a different perspective than what we saw in the last session, but all these things do kind of work out together pretty well. So, as you mentioned, I joined NRPA about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and about a month into the job, I inherited a project that we commissioned with some academics at Penn State University, led by Dr. Mallon. And this was a study that we commissioned that was an update of a previous study that we had commissioned 25 years earlier. And it was a pretty in-depth study about the perceptions, Americans' perceptions about park and recreation. And we get the results back, and it's a long report. I read a shorter version of it. The long report's like 150 or so pages, and there's a lot of stuff in here, and I'm going to summarize the whole report on this one slide here. At least the one sort of interesting takeaway is that, according to that study, 7 out of 10 Americans say they go to their local park on a regular basis. 83%, a little over 8 out of 10, say that they personally benefit from Parks and Rec, and a little over 9 out of 10 say that their communities benefit from park and recreation. And to be very clear, what this means is that you don't have to be a user of parks and recreation to believe that you personally get benefits from it and that your community benefits from it. This may seem obvious, but let me tell you something that was interesting about this study. As I mentioned, the study was conducted 25 years earlier, and they got literally the same results. The numbers barely budged, which is a phenomenal thing, going back to the early 90s. Before in the early 90s, these things didn't exist. Facebook, social media, thankfully, there was a much nicer time when that didn't exist. Obviously we still had TV, but maybe not 500 channels available to us. We surely didn't have streaming video available to us. And despite all that, despite these changes, despite the demographic shift in our nation, basically we're seeing that when we asked them the exact same questions in the exact same context, that they were answering these questions exactly the same. That the strong support for parks and recreation, maybe not everyone is super passionate about parks and recreation, and I'm about to say something that's obvious, but it's an important point. Everyone likes the work you do. No one dislikes the work that you do. There may be a few loudmouths out there, but otherwise, this is something that almost anything else that's represented in Washington, D.C. as an industry, no one dislikes the work that we do. And maybe we have not fully, as a profession, and I'm just saying from the national perspective, maybe not fully harnessed that energy. The other thing that's interesting about these numbers is that, and you'll hear this over and over again during my presentation, is that these numbers basically hold true by age, by household formation. So whether it's a family that has a couple kids still living there, or it's just a single person, a married couple without kids, race and ethnicity, wealth, even politics. D's and R's agreed with these scenarios. And the numbers might have been, in some cases, would move a little bit, but the overall assumption here, the overall statement here is that there's strong support for the work that we do. It holds almost across every demographic group. And that may be a little surprising because when you hear the people on the fringes, they're the loudest and they will speak otherwise. But this is actually a common belief. So that study told us that, it told me, because again, I was doing the job, because I found this was fascinating, even if some of my colleagues at the time did not, saying, this is something we need to be taking greater advantage of. This is the American public actually is your greatest advocate, and maybe we have not harnessed that power very well. So we started doing some things on a regular basis to collect more data like this, and then to translate it back out to help empower some professionals across the country about where we are today. So one of them is this Americans' Engagement in PARCC study that we launched in 2016. We released it at our conference in the fall. We released the second one in 2017. We'll do one again this fall. And we asked a variety of questions of Americans again, 1,000 Americans across the country, sort of representing the population. And one of the first questions we asked is basically, again, where are they PARCC users? And then typically, the typical American, and no one's typical, but we always have to give a summary number here, is that basically Americans typically visit a park about twice a month. Their local public parks twice a month. And it does vary greatly. You see about 10%, saying they're there at least once a week, if not more frequently. And, there's still 2 out of 5 that are, maybe, a handful of times a year. But nonetheless, most people basically make it there about twice a month. We asked a couple questions because this is a recurring theme. There's only so much the taxing authority in a local government, even if in a situation where, like you are, where you actually have some of your own taxing authority, this is a little bit less of an issue what I'm about to talk about, but it's still in play. But in many areas of the country is that Park and Recreation is drawing from the exact same tax fund that's paying for police and fire and education. So we asked a question. We put basically 10 common local government provided services, things like public safety and education and transportation and so forth. And we asked them on a 5-point scale to rate them, and basically what we see here is that Park and Recreation actually does quite well. Basically 9 out of 10 basically agree that Parks and Recreation is an important service. It does, this public safety is a little bit higher, but again, when we asked the question very directly and described what it meant, there is strong support. That second number there is a very common question you've seen elsewhere. The National Association of Realtors used to ask this question. I used to work at NAR. I actually ran this question once there. It was kind of neat to see that something I did 15 years ago still is out there. So I inserted in this year's engagement survey and basically asked how important it is to have high-quality parks and recreation amenities available to you when you choose a place to live. And 6 out of 7 says it's very important to them. Again, common sense stuff, but again, these are the numbers we need to be pounding away to sort of reinforce where we all kind of knew anecdotally, but people react better to numbers. Again, you'll see the same phrase I just said before. Support crosses every demographic group you could think of. It crosses political parties. It crosses racial groups and household formation. Very consistent numbers there. We talked about our pillars. I only want to mention this briefly because one of our 3 pillars, as was mentioned, is conservation, along with health and wellness and social equity. And again, very robust cross-sectional support for all 3 of the NRPA pillars. And we asked this question actually in 2 different ways. We actually stated the pillars. And as you can imagine, sometimes people have a knee-jerk reaction to words such as conservation, words such as social equity. So also we took those words out of the question and talked about it more of sort of broad concept of what we mean by that. And what we found actually, basically again, when you sort of define what these terms mean, you see strong support for these concepts, including conserving the natural environment and protecting open space. Consistent support. In this year's study, we also asked the question, sorry, it didn't appear as clearly as I'd hoped, but we also asked the question about the importance of how valuable natural resources are in their community. And again, you see sort of this really strong support. It's obvious. People, again, dislike it. Again, the recurring theme here is people like the work you do. And there's a punchline to all this in a moment. I'm going to get to it in a few moments. This year's survey, which we conducted back in June, we also every year in the survey, we actually take some themes. And so about a third, maybe about half the survey is about the same year to year. But the other half, we're going to take out, we're going to basically have questions that are specific to the year. So in 2016, we asked things about the election. Perhaps you knew there was an election that year. It seemed like it was a good idea to ask questions about that. In 2017, the theme we went down was conservation and resiliency. Again, this ran before the hurricanes, this ran before the fires in California and so forth. And even in that context, we found that basically when we described what resiliency meant, sometimes some of the kinds of the questions actually did use the term climate change. Sometimes the questions actually made a point not to include them in there. We basically saw, again, consistent support when we talked about the importance of using natural resources such as open public space to help build a community's resiliency to natural disasters. There was strong support for that. And as you see, that basically almost everyone also believes that how important it is to protect the natural environment by maintaining and acquiring new open space and green spaces. And again, the same phrase again of consistent support across the board, across all demographic groups. I mentioned in 2016 that the theme of that study was actually about politics, and got some interesting numbers that came back on it. But here's one I think in the context of this and this environment that we live in today is, and you could decide how strongly people really believe this or not. When we asked about when you were being described, when a particular political leader makes park and recreation as a priority, the protection of open space as a priority, the protection of all the services that come from park and recreation, they tell us, the survey results came back and told us, is that there was strong, again, support, that they'd be more likely to vote, all things being held equal, they'd be more likely to vote someone who supported parks and recreation. And again, you see that the R number is a little bit lower. If the person described themselves as a Republican, the number is a little bit lower than it is for a Democrat. That's still 7 out of 10, though. It's saying of Republicans that said they would do that. You're more likely to support this phrase or support a politician who supports park and recreation if you're a user. Okay, not particularly surprising, but it is sort of the overlap there if you're more engaged. But even for non-park users, 2 out of 5 are still basically supportive of the concept. Going back to that thing we talked about earlier, is that if you didn't have to be a park user, you don't have to be an avid park user to understand its value to a community and what it can mean in so many different ways. So the other thing we launched a couple years ago that's interesting, that's been interesting in the organization, it's actually probably, in my words, probably the cheesiest thing that we do. It turns out to be the most popular thing one of the most popular things we seem to be providing for our members are these little, what we call PARCC polls. What we're doing here is we're buying space onto a market research omnibus survey. Basically, it's a market research companies surveying Americans on a variety of topics, and essentially we're buying a seat on the survey to ask questions. So we've always been, since for the last 2 years, we've been asking a variety of questions. Some are kind of things about, what are your favorite outdoor recreation activities, or, do you like watching the fireworks, on the 4th of July that's being run by your local agency and so forth. But also we've been asking serious questions too, and we did 2 on conservation within the last year. One of them is basically see a strong support for the protection of open space. We defined what this meant and saying how, all things being equal, how important is it for you. You see that basically 82% of Americans agree with the statement. More specifically, about 62% were really strongly agreed with the statement. And you would see stronger support for the statement among millennials. Although even the support as you get a little among older Americans, whether it's a Gen Xer or a baby boomer, is a little bit softer, but still rather high. What's not on this graphic here is also parents. We're another population that if you had children in your household under the age of 18, you were probably a little bit more likely to support sort of this phrase and this concept. The other one we ran recently dealt with the support for sustainability for efforts, and basically the importance of the local government, at the local government level, presumably through, among other things, the Park and Recreation Agency, the Conservation District, or whatever, seeing how important it was for this type of activity. Again, millennials were more likely to support this. Families with children were more likely to support these types of activities. The one thing about the Park Pulse polls that we can't do with the other surveys, because we're buying a seat on a survey that we can't design too tightly. The one thing we're not getting back is political data. I'm always one to ask the political data because I'm trying to actually break, trying to break some preconceptions about, not saying that whether certain people are good or bad or evil or not. I'm just sort of saying we actually agree on more things than we don't. And we tend to react to noise for very understandable reasons. But actually, there is this sort of, I think, a phrase that was given to me a little bit this morning, or a little bit earlier this morning, is that there is sort of this silent majority that's out there that agrees on concepts. They may not be. They may not be the ones who are blogging as loudly as others are. They may not be the ones sending the letters all the time. But when you describe the concept out very cleanly to them, there is strong support for the work that we do across our nation. So we walked through all this, and I told you something that you already knew, but I gave you some data that basically the American public loves the work that you do. It's an important takeaway here. I know you probably knew this, but there is data behind it. And it isn't just the loud people on one side of the political spectrum who agree with this. It is generally across the board, and it's one of the things that sort of actually unite us. Unfortunately, in most situations, it is not the general public who determines, at least directly, the money that you're going to be getting, that an agency actually gets. To state the obvious, it's government officials, it's the elected officials, in some cases the appointed officials who are actually making these decisions. So what do they think? So to answer that question, we went back to our friends at Penn State and Dr. Mallon again, and they conducted a study for us that we released last fall. And it was a survey of elected and appointed local government officials across the United States. Actually hit all 50 states, 810 results. And there's a lot of interesting information here, and I'm going to walk through a few here and kind of make a few connections here. So we asked the question about whether they're PARCC users and whether they love PARCCs. And so like a good politician, they said, of course we use PARCCs, and of course we love PARCCs. And I'll take them at that word there. Again, the numbers are a little bit higher in the air for the general public. There's really no reason not to believe these numbers, but again, it's the job of a person in this type of position to be saying that kind of statement. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because we're going to look at what their actions actually speak. Okay, so we asked the question about typically provided local government services. Okay, where does Park and Recreation actually stand in this? And by the way, I need to be clear about this. Penn State ran the study for us, and they conducted it for us, but they were actually very transparent to the people who were filling out these surveys, who the study was commissioning it. So it isn't like, you're going to see a few things in a few moments here that will seem a little odd for a study that they knew who was paying for it, presumably, that public officials weren't even trying to couch or even trying to hide what their true feelings were. So here's one here. Some of you've all experienced, I'm sure you see, is that basically at the end of the day, while they see you as basically as a moderately important, provided government service, there are things that rate higher. And there are things that you probably deep down, either in your brain or down in your heart, you kind of knew were going to be there. Public safety, so police and fire, education, transportation is a little bit higher, health and hospitals and health is a little bit higher too. Parks and Recreation does score a little bit higher than libraries, does score a little bit higher than corrections, just a little bit above public welfare. So in this survey, like the common theme I'm talking about, we did actually ask some information about both the size of the jurisdiction. We asked about their own personal politics, but also how they would characterize the overall political environment they're working in. Did they tend to be a liberal-leaning district, area? Did they tend to be a more conservative-leaning district, and so forth? This list doesn't really change that much off of that. And again, it's kind of where we are. I would describe it as sort of moderately, seen as moderately important. And it's better than not being seen as important. But at the end of the day, they're going to support teachers first and education first, perhaps. So we asked a question here about what keeps them up at night. This is the question that kind of really begins to determine, and we didn't ask the question about number 9 about me getting reelected, but presumably these are sort of the themes that sort of wrap around there. And it's fine. I don't even mean to be snide about or cynical about that. I mean, it's a legitimate a goal for everyone. Basically, the thing that keeps them up at night, the thing that they see as most important in their job is basically attracting and retaining businesses in their region. It's basically job creation and higher, more and better paying jobs makes people happy, and so you're more likely to get reelected. It also helps take care of issues about tax base and and revenues and so forth. Not surprising there. Number 2 is preventing youth crime, community quality of life. Number 3, growth management. Number 4, you can see sort of the list going on there. I know that like number 7, is a little disturbing there. I guess in some ways I'm not overly surprised by that. You did see a little bit, it would rank a little bit higher among those that reported working in a district or serving a district that was a little bit more liberal. I was a little surprising enhancing real estate values was not as high, but of course that may be an artifact of exactly how their tax base and how their property taxes are actually determined. It may not, higher property values don't always mean more revenue if you're forced to essentially have this forced revenue stream coming through. So we didn't ask the question, the $64,000 question. Okay, you told us what was most important. How well do you think Parks and Recreation actually support these goals? And the good news is that they see that parks and recreation, they do a very good job improving the quality of life in the community. Awesome. They also see that it helps prevent youth crime. That's also awesome. Helps improve community health, although not as high of a priority for them, but they agree that Parks and Recreation does a fine job at that. But the number one thing that they actually say is the most important thing, the thing that keeps them up at night, is something that they don't necessarily have made the connection about, something that we do very well. That we're making as big of a contribution as they need. They're not making that connection. It's a very interesting comment, by the way, because again, number 3 there is improving community quality of life. Quality of life is a significant determinant about why a company chooses to move to a certain area or stay in a certain area. If the company's executives themselves don't like the area, they're not going to move the company there. They have their own self-interest. But more importantly, how do they attract employees? You know, if a region is attractive, they can not only be building off the job base that's already there, the employment base that's already in that region, they can actually recruit people to move to that area to come work for that company if they think the area is very nice. There's a little bit of a disconnect there. There's a perceptions gap here that we're looking a little bit more closely at. And it begins to explain something we're about to show next, which is I thought was the most interesting thing out of this study. And I'm surprised. I find it interesting because, again, we were very open about who was sponsoring the study, and people were very honest with us. And that is this. So we did ask a question about whether the money that's spent on Park and Recreation is actually worth it. And we asked this of public officials. And, you know, again, on this sort of, it's kind of like the question about do you go to parks? This question doesn't have really a lot of meat behind it either. But we were actually getting to a point here, is that basically when we asked appointed officials, asked elected officials, they agreed that Parks and Recreation money was well spent. It was money they were proud to spend for their community, and they saw value out of it. And again, the numbers move around a little bit, but again, regardless of political persuasion and agency type or region type, it was basically the numbers were strong. This is the slide that helps belie or sort of cause falsehoods on the previous slide, though. So the researchers did a couple interesting things here. They said, okay, well, you said it's well worth the money. So let's imagine a couple hypotheticals. Let's imagine that suddenly there's like $10 million came out of the sky, and you have more money to spend for your region. Where would you spend those dollars? So in the second column there is basically how they would distribute those extra dollars. And Parks and Recreation does pretty well. It would see about 14.7 cents for every dollar that kind of came in. They would actually begin, sort of that additional dollar, they would attribute 15 cents to Parks and Recreation. That was fourth, which sits behind transportation, education, and the police. And so that's pretty good. Nothing to sneeze at for sure. The problem is that then we asked, okay, so what happens if like suddenly you had to cut the budget by, say, $10 million? Where would you take the money from? And congratulations, Parks and Recreation is number 1 on this list. We were number 1. And that's problematic, I mean, to say the least. And actually, it's something that you all know and you've all experienced. If you ever, whether here at McHenry or through maybe other experiences you've had elsewhere, you know when times are tough, where they're going to try to find the dollars. In some ways, this is perceived as being an easy dollar. What I take away from this slide is that Parks and Recreation is probably in some ways seen as the most discretionary thing that's sitting in a local government budget. Now, again, things are a little bit different here because of your taxing authority, but even the context you were talking a little bit earlier, the pressure is still there, and it's still sort of in play here. And it's the most discretionary dollar. Now, discretionary is good in the sense that they see value from it, and they could choose not to give you that extra dollar when they exist. But on the flip side is the first place they go after the dollar, in a survey that was sponsored by NRPA, that was transparent to them with NRPA, they said, oh yeah, it's you. It's definitely, we're going to take your money away first. And it's not surprising necessarily we're sort of on the bottom of the list, and perhaps it all makes sense also. I'm not even really going to debate that. It's just here's sort of proving that it isn't just what's happening here or happening to some of your neighbors. This is happening across the country and so forth. So this is a hypothetical. But hypotheticals only have so much value, so what's the reality? So in a different study that Dr. Mallon and some of his researchers did, that we didn't, I think to be transparent, we did not commission this, but the numbers so matched the survey, it was sort of cool to take a look at, is they picked up on a study that John Crompton and Andy Kaczynski ran 10, 15 years ago that looked at parks and recreation spending over basically the 60s through basically 2000. Okay, there was a couple studies actually. And what they saw was that during that time period, there was a clear increase in parks and recreation spending across the country at a very nice, healthy clip. And these are the stories that even right before this session, talking to one of your colleagues about that, he was describing basically what that study had shown and the experiences that there was an increased investment in these areas and sort of in the view of it. So they went back and took a look at these Penn State researchers went back and said, well, that study ended in 2003, so they're going to pick up the ball and look what happened over the next 10 years. And of course, during those 10 years, the Great Recession occurred that really squeezed, among other things, property values, which of course in many areas dramatically squeezed local property tax revenues. So this chart here, this purple line here represents, it's nationwide, represents the increase or decrease in park and recreation spending across the country versus 2003 after adjustments for inflation. And what you'll see is that between 2003 to 2008, basically when the recession hit, parks and recreation spending was up 15% after inflation adjustments. So that was real growth that was going on there after taking care of rising prices. Not shocking to anyone in this room, I'm sure, is that at that point, that's when everything began to reverse. And by 2013, the revenues actually, or the expenditures on local parks and recreation was now 7% below where they were in 2003 after you adjust for inflation. During the same time period, the US population, I think, grew about 9%. So you're serving 9% more people with 7% fewer resources. So not surprising. So you may know where I'm about to go with this. What about everyone else? So here's a big messy chart to show you what happened to everyone else. And actually during those early years, going back to that discretionary comment I made, is that between 2003 and 2008, Parks and Recreation actually was outperforming basically every other local provided government service in the region. Again, this is a national number. Your local experiences, of course, will vary a bit, but it's doing very well. What you do also notice there is that when the recession hit, most people did take a hit, especially over the first few years, but some people took a much bigger hit than others, and more importantly, some agencies or some departments basically recovered rather quickly. And again, this study ends in 2013 because that's how far the data was available. This is US Census Bureau data, by the way. And kind of to make this point even more clear is we now just focus at 2008 to 2013. And what you see there basically is, again, Parks and Recreation was number one. Parks and Recreation basically was at the peak of the very top of the roller coaster and basically went all the way to almost to the bottom of the ride. Whereas things such as public safety and education held out a little bit better. Again, not surprising, but again, the anecdotal things that not just what you've been experiencing here, but you've seen what your neighbors are experiencing. It's happening across the country. It's systematic. It's happening. The fiscal pressures that are going on with local government is real. The nationwide real estate prices have only really recovered within the last year or two from its pre-recession peak. And of course, that's been very uneven and so forth. And so therefore, tax revenues, even if the tax rate had stayed the same, tax revenues are still having difficulty catching up, especially after inflation. So we're going to go back to that engagement survey for a second. And that is that we asked the question, this is the thing that was previewed a few minutes earlier, or a few hours earlier, is we have this thing that's called, we have a database, a benchmarking database that's called PARCC, where we have over 1,000 park and recreation agencies across the country, a bunch of information about, say, personnel and budgets and services they provided. So we have some budget information. And in the report we published last year, the typical agency, and again, no agency is typical, but the typical agency nonetheless spends $77.32 on an annual basis for every resident in its community. Those numbers can vary dramatically. Now, the context here is about $26, $25? Yeah. So this is triple the size. Now, I have to give a little bit of context. This is park and recreation agencies. While McHenry provides some recreation activities, these are agencies that are also, providing, out-of-school time programming, senior centers, and so forth, which, is not as much of your area of focus. So that boils down to a little less, nonetheless, a little less to just under $7 per month per capita. So she referenced McDonald's. In the value menu, my reference here is basically, I'm old enough to remember a TV commercial back in the 80s with Sally Struthers talking about the charity that she was raising money for, and would always use the line of, for 28 cents a day, you can support us, and may use the line for less than a cost of a cup of coffee. Now, coffee prices have, a lot higher today, of course. But actually, that line actually kind of works here. I don't drink coffees, but I understand people pay $6 or $7 with straight face. Will pay $6 or $7 for a cup of coffee. So for less than a cup of coffee, that's how much park and recreation activities cost at a typical agency across the country on a per capita basis in a month. It represents roughly about 2% of local government spending. It's a very generalized number I'm pulling from the Census Bureau there. I basically divided some numbers there just to get some context. So in that engagement survey I mentioned, back in 2016, in the first year, we mentioned this number to people. So a typical agency spends $7 per month for every resident in the community. If that number had gone up, if that number goes up, we could do more. What are your thoughts about that? And 75% of Americans said they'd support that. Because again, we couch these numbers into what they really are. There's a story across the profession every time. Well, someone will call and complain about something, and my tax dollars are paying for this, and saying, well, here's $3. That was your contribution, for this week for it, and because there's really not that much money going into parks and recreation. So when we ask these questions and couch in this context, people support the money. And by the way, one last thing about this slide and about this number, whether what you're spending here, what the national median actually is that this is a great story about this industry. This is an incredibly effective field that is also remarkably efficient, is providing great value for really very few dollars. This is, regardless of what someone thinks about government and whether government's efficient or not, this is not an example of something where government is not being efficient. It's being very effective in doing it for very few dollars. This is an awesome story. Nonetheless, I'm sure we'd like to have a few more dollars. And so we asked about that. So it was $7, so what about $7.50? What about $8? What about $9, $10, $11, $12? And basically, we found out that the typical American who was willing to spend more money would be willing to spend $9 per month on a per capita basis, which is about 30% more than where the median is today. Again, these are hypotheticals, but on the other hand, it's sort of couching what these numbers really are. You're talking about, you spent more money on lunch yesterday than what your community is spending on park and recreation. And I think that helps sort of build support. So going back to the official study, we asked some questions about what do they see as the funding priorities for parks and recreation in their community. The biggest thing is basically maintaining areas that already exist, which is interesting because O&M budgets are the ones that get squeezed the most. But what they are interested in things about connectivity, about biking trails and pedestrian trails. They are interested in seeing more programming, which again, probably not as relevant for this conversation today. You will see two other categories there that may be of interest to you: acquiring and protect open space as undeveloped land. 56% of local officials have support for that. About half of local officials support acquiring new land for developed recreation. So pretty interesting. One of the things they don't see as a priority is, of course, adding more staff. And I'll show you. I'll show you more in a moment about how that's also not a hypothetical. But it's sort of an important point because that's the biggest part of any agency's O&M budget. So the same folks, I keep on mentioning this, our friends at Penn State, in that same study that was showing where the numbers have been going for the last 10 years, looked at employment trends in this field from 2000 to 2014. And basically over this time period, basically the employment grew by about 42,000 in the field. Unfortunately, what is happening is that we're seeing this slow but gradual shift away from full-time employment to part-time employment. And we know the reasons why for that. It's about benefits, and it's about cost and the pressures of taking on liabilities, whether it's, I know the issues about pensions are, weigh heavily on the state, but even if you aren't offering pensions, things about health care and so forth are trying. At the same time, we are seeing sort of this deprofessionalization of the field, and that weighs on the budget. it's not necessarily a long conversation for this here, but this is something that, from NRPA's perspective, we're trying to figure out how to best manage this. Because those that are staying in the field, those who will be the full-time people, they're going to be wearing more hats than they were wearing in the past. And how do we support them? And so we've been watching this, and it's an interesting conversation. So one last thing I want to talk about here is about the economic impact. I promised to talk to you about this. So 2 years ago, we released the first ever nationwide study on local parks and recreation. A lot of local agencies have done some on their own. The city of Chicago had a very interesting study they released back in 2015. And in this study here, which only looked at operations and capital spending, basically the impacts of just those two things, those two things alone in 2013 were responsible for $140 billion in economic activity and nearly 1 million jobs. You know, we're in a $17 trillion economy in the United States. So, I mean, $140 billion, while it's a lot of money to anyone in this room, you know, it would keep some perspective there. On the flip side here is that for all the good things we do, we also do this. This is also happening. And then when you cut budgets in parks and recreation, you actually are hurting economic activity. You actually are hurting job creation and jobs in the community. In 2013, the Illinois number was almost $13 billion and nearly 100,000 jobs. So these aren't just jobs that are actually how many people are on payrolls. These are jobs that are actually rippling through the economy through induced and indirect impact. So if you hire vendors to do some of your work, those people are employed. But also when an agency's employees spend money in the community, eating at restaurants, paying rent, and so forth, well, that induces more economic activity also. So the key thing here is again, putting a number behind this and saying it's not zero, because up to this point, we didn't have a number, so everyone assumed the number was zero. There are other things, and we've actually seen, we had a great presentation earlier this morning, taking a look at the impact of conservation and resiliency. The nationwide study, it's actually not practical to have all these things on the list. The study from 2013 would still be going on today if they tried to tackle these things. But there's a lot of other positive impacts. We're going to hear about visitor spending. We're going to hear about health and wellness benefits, that sort of lower insurance costs in the community, property values, as we talked about it before. And that last bullet there about economic development, to sort of bring this all back together, is that we know parks and recreation creates jobs in communities and actually entices companies to be in certain areas. If you had a chance to read the Amazon HQ2 proposal, they talked about, they wanted to hear about recreational opportunities in the community that they're going to choose to. I live in one of the 20 finalists. Actually, the DC area has 3 of the 20 finalists. Some people think that's why it's going to be one of those 3 areas, and we're going to get those 3 areas to compete. But actually, all 3 of those communities do have strong park and recreation activities. And so forth. We're going to be releasing a study later this year that's actually going to get a little bit more about the parks and recreation impact on economic development. The reality is, if you ever watch a tourism video that's released by the local tourism group or the economic development group, when they're sort of putting their packages together, Parks and Recreation is actually has always been a part of this activity. They just haven't bothered to invite the director to be a part of the conversation. They are in some areas, and that's what the study is going to be about. But if they're taking photos of your trails, they're taking photos of your lakes, they're taking photos of everything you have, they just haven't bothered to say, bring someone over to the agency to help sort of finish the deal. So the other good news is that we're going to be, in about 2 weeks, going to be updating the study, the nationwide economic impact study. It would be wrong for me to tell you the numbers because we're supposed to make a news event out of it, but it's going to be about 10% higher for both of those numbers. I will give one little small caveat, is the methodology of how the state level numbers were done a little bit differently. In some states, the numbers went up and went down because of the methodology change, and perhaps Illinois was one of the states that the numbers are a little bit lower. But nonetheless, Illinois is still going to be has the second largest impact of any state in the country after California. And actually, on a per capita basis, Illinois is number 1. So not surprising. It's a state that's been dedicated, that's had a true dedication to public parks. So here are my final takeaways, sort of the key punchlines here, is that you might have already known it, but Parks and Recreation is something that the American public strongly supports, even if they don't have to be a user to take advantage of it. They see these investments being well worth the money that they're going into it, and they would support increased funding, especially when you couch it in the context of what those dollars really mean. It's relative pocket change when you look at it on a per capita basis. Local officials also like park and recreation, but maybe not as strongly or as passionate as Americans do. And they agree in some areas park and recreation are a great solution provider, but there is sort of this disconnect about economic development. And as a result, we do see that when times are tough, they fully acknowledge that the bullseye is on the field. Is on their budgets. And we've seen over the last 10 years the real impact of that. And whether the economy continues to expand or not, the fiscal pressures that face every local government, state government, even the federal government are going to continue to build. And as a result, you have to fight for every dollar that exists, regardless of even how written in law, how the funding is coming in. There's opportunities that exist, and they're looking at the numbers you're doing. We're going to try to address this at the national level, try to get the tools, but this is a real issue. And with that, I thank you. They have time.
Do you have time for a couple questions up there? Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
Chart, you said that people want to see investment in their local parks to help natural disasters. Can you give examples of that?
Often in a lot of areas. Also, the question is about examples where parks are being used to sort of build the resiliency in a community against natural disasters. And so there have been some communities recently that, as they're taking land out of production, say for commercial or residential real estate, because they're in floodplains, well, you could turn them into a park. That's a park 98% of the time, and the other 2% of the time becomes a floodplain. What happened in Houston actually was, and Houston has a lot of challenges, but there were certain things that actually did work well in Houston, and actually some of their parkland actually, even though it was being flooded out, was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing there. It's something that we at the national level have really been pushing for. And again, we don't have to get into the debate about climate change with anyone, or we try to have that silly argument. But people do know there are tornadoes and hurricanes and winter storms and so forth. Those things exist, and fires and so forth, and people understand that and saying, well, if you do this, it's cheaper for the community in the long run, and maybe diverts that water away. So.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, please.
When you look at your data, is there any way to focus in on people moving to places like McHenry County because of the existing park and recreation, and how that impacts economic development?
So the data itself is not going to be that specific. Everything we have is national, and the data is not thick enough to get down to that type of region. But we've been part of the economic development study that we're working on with our colleagues at George Mason University are looking specifically about that impact about recruiting, essentially parks and recreation being not only recruiting companies, but actually recruiting workers. And that itself also helps feed and recruiting businesses also. Yeah, and so we're going to be taking a closer look at that. It's like one of these things you mentioned. We kind of know it exists, and we're just trying to figure out how to capture that data in a way that we can say with greater definitivity, not just use anecdotal anecdotes.
One final question, and then we need to get moving on.
Yes, please.
It seems to me the thesis or that we're trending toward less funding, and when the funding does come our way, if it comes, we're the first ones to suffer. Whereas education seems to be the one that wouldn't suffer or be one of the last ones to suffer. Is the public sector filling in the gap at all? Is the private interest filling in the gap? How so?
So one of the things that we've been talking about, so the question is basically, is the private sector able to fill some of the gaps for the public sector? And the answer to that question is a definitive somewhat. There are areas where the private sector, especially on capital expenditures, actually doing the purchasing, buying the land, building the buildings, and so forth. There's a lot of interest from foundations and I can't speak, from donations and so forth from foundations to help fund those type of projects. What you see greater struggles for is actually paying for O&M. No one. You will see people at a ribbon cutting. You see a mayor or the media, the ribbon cutting for a new rec center or for a new park. You don't tend to see those same people showing up when they empty the trash a week later, even though that's the problem. That's the real funding problem, right? People like to build stuff. People don't like to maintain stuff. And the last part of it, just to be real fast, that's also a little bit of a challenge when the private sector handles funding, is that we have the social equity issue that gets into play. The benefit of having a local government fund these types of things through tax dollars and so forth is that there's going to be, presumably, hopefully there's a greater assurance that everyone in the community is able to benefit from what's being built. I'm not saying the private sector is not interested in that, but sometimes the private sector is only interested in working in certain parts of the community, and only because that's just where their interests are. Maybe there's not necessarily any ill intent behind it, but they're interested in X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, ABC is not getting anything out of it, and there's sort of this balancing issue, and the profession itself, and the industry, I keep on calling it the industry, but the field itself, it needs to figure out how do you continue to deliver on that social equity mission of making sure that everyone has access to open space, to parks and recreational amenities, while at the same time facing this funding challenge that's not going to go away. And my last point about all that is that even despite the fact that the numbers are shrinking, the pressure is there, we have to continue to be putting the pressure back onto them and say the public sector needs to be paying for this, because the moment you take that pressure off, you're not holding people accountable. The rest of those dollars are going to go away tomorrow, because there are other people looking for those dollars, the police and education and so forth, fire. They need their dollars too, and they're going to be loud, and people are for safety and for education. They should be, and they are for this too. We just have not been as vocal as we should have been in the past. Very good. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. A lot to think about. So we're going to get back in your groups again, same groups for the morning, and you're going to have a lovely conversation and help us and guide us, and then we will have lunch. So again, thank you so much, and enjoy.